Today, we're going to talk about how you build a nation on paper. We're diving into the legislative journey of India's independence, and we're going to do it by looking at 4 key laws passed by the British Parliament. Now, this isn't just about dusty legal documents. This is the story of how a colony was legally taken apart, and how a new country was built, piece by painful piece.
So, let's start with that big question. How do you turn a colony into a country? I mean, it's a huge undertaking. For India, it wasn't just one big revolutionary moment. It was a slow, messy, and often painful evolution. It was a path that was paved not just with protests in the streets, but with parchment, with laws and constitutions. So, let's walk that path, one act at a time.
All right, so our story kicks off right here with the very first, very tentative step. This is the Government of India Act of 1909. You'll often hear it called the Morley-Minto Reforms, named after the 2 British officials who cooked it up. And this was a big deal. Well, kinda. It was the first time the British government formally admitted that, yeah, maybe Indians should have some say in how they're governed.
And here was the headline. For the very first time, Indians were allowed inside the legislative councils. They could debate, they could ask tough questions, they could even discuss the budget. But, and this is a huge but, they had no power to actually vote on that budget. So you've got a voice, sure, but a voice with no real teeth.
But this 1909 Act also introduced something else, a concept that would have absolutely massive consequences: separate electorates. Now, this came about because Muslim leaders were worried their voices would get drowned out in a Hindu-majority system. So the idea was that in certain areas, only Muslim voters could elect Muslim representatives. It guaranteed representation, but man, it came at a price.
And this really shows you the Act's total paradox. On the one hand, it cracked the door open. It was the very beginning of Indian participation in government. But on the other hand, by literally dividing the electorate along religious lines, it planted these seeds of communal politics. And those seeds would grow into something much, much bigger down the road.
So, as you can imagine, that first little step wasn't enough. The demands for reform just got louder and louder. Which brings us directly to our second act, the Government of India Act of 1919. You might also hear this one called the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. This wasn't just another small step. This was a much bigger, much more complicated experiment in power.
The official line, the big promise behind this act, was the gradual development of self-governing institutions. And you have to pay really close attention to that word, gradual. The British weren't about to just hand over the keys to the kingdom. Nope. The plan was to dole out power in small, very controlled doses. And to do that, they came up with a new, and let's be honest, very confusing system.
That system was called diarchy, which basically just means dual government. And here's the gist of it. They took all the things a provincial government does and split them into 2 lists. The really important stuff, the police, the justice system, the money, those were reserved subjects, and they stayed firmly in British hands. The other stuff, like education and public health, became transferred subjects. Those were managed by Indian ministers.
The Act did a few other things too. It created the first ever 2-house legislature at the national level, and it expanded the number of voters to about 10% of the population. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? The top British official, the viceroy, still held the ultimate veto power. So, at the end of the day, no matter how things looks, real control wasn't actually going anywhere.
So what happened? Well, unsurprisingly, diarchy was a complete mess. It was confusing, it created all this friction, and it satisfied absolutely no one. Indian leaders felt like they had all this responsibility, but none of the actual power to get things done. And all this failure did was pour fuel on the fire, leading to even bigger demands for the next step: full control over the provinces.
That failure of diarchy led directly to something much, much bigger. And that brings us to what is arguably the most important piece of legislation before independence, the Government of India Act of 1935. This wasn't just another reform, folks. This was the actual blueprint for the Constitution of modern India.
This act was a complete game changer. For starters, it threw diarchy in the trash, at least in the provinces. Indian ministers finally got provincial autonomy. It also introduced the 3 lists for dividing power: federal, provincial, and concurrent. If that sounds familiar, it's because India still uses that system today. It also set up a federal court, the forerunner to the Supreme Court, and public service commissions. You are literally watching the architecture of a modern country being built.
And this is why this act is so incredibly important. It was the training ground, it was the dress rehearsal for independence.
When Indian leaders took control of provincial governments after the 1937 elections, they were using this very framework. They were learning how to govern, using a blueprint that would massively influence the constitution they'd write for themselves just a decade later.
But then, World War II changed everything. And suddenly, the demand for more self-rule became a demand for complete and total independence now. And that brings us to the final, incredibly dramatic act in our story, the Indian Independence Act of 1947. This is the law that delivered freedom, but also brought unimaginable tragedy.
The pace of what happened in 1947 is just breathtaking. Seriously, in just a matter of months, nearly 2 centuries of British rule came to a crashing, chaotic end. The Mountbatten Plan drops, laying out the partition, the Independence Act is rushed through Parliament in London, and then bam, August 15th hits, and 2 new independent nations, India and Pakistan, stand where a single colony used to be.
So, what did this final act actually do? Well, it was simple and absolute. First, it ended all British rule and authority in India. Period. Done. Second, it created the 2 independent countries, India and Pakistan, which meant partitioning the massive provinces of Punjab and Bengal. And most importantly, it transferred all lawmaking power to the new governments of each nation. The power was finally and fully in their hands.
So let's bring this all together. When you step back and look at these 4 acts, what's the legacy? Well, they really map out a journey, don't they? It's a step-by-step transfer of power, moving from a colony with barely a voice to a full-fledged nation with its own constitution.
You can really see the whole story laid out here. It starts in 1909 with that first little bit of participation, but also the beginning of division. That leads to the failed experiment of 1919 with diarchy. Out of that failure, you get the crucial 1935 blueprint for self-governance. And finally, that all leads to 1947, partition and the final transfer of sovereignty. Each act was like a reaction to the last one, pushing the story forward to its inevitable conclusion.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty heavy question to think about. That 1935 Act, it actually proposed an all-India federation. That just never happened, thanks to World War II and all the political divisions. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How might history have been different if that blueprint for a united, self-governing India had actually been built before the world and the subcontinent was changed forever?